Every monument hides a story. Every stone whispers a past. Welcome to History Vault, where history comes alive. A silent dawn blankets the rolling fields of Pennsylvania. Mist clings to the ridges, hiding secrets buried beneath the earth. Once, these quiet hills bore witness to thunderous cannons, endless marches, and the clash of tens of thousands of soldiers. Here at Gettysburg, fate and destiny collided in a 3-day storm of courage, fear, and unimaginable sacrifice, an encounter that would forever shape the story of a nation. Step into the place where history, heroism, and mystery converge. In the early 1860s, the United States was no longer a nation at peace with itself. The bonds that had once held the Union together were strained, frayed, and ultimately broken by the deep divide between North and South. Slavery, states' rights, and political power had fueled tensions for decades, but by 1861, those tensions exploded into full-scale war. The Confederacy, led by Jefferson Davis and some of the most daring generals in American history, sought independence from the Union, while Abraham Lincoln, with resolve etched deep into his character, fought to preserve the United States as one nation, indivisible. As the war dragged into its third year, the bloodshed had reached unimaginable levels, yet the conflict still had no decisive end in sight. It was in this moment of uncertainty that both armies began to turn their gaze toward the quiet fields and rolling hills of Pennsylvania. The year was 1863, and Confederate General Robert E. Lee had grown bold. Victories in battles like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville had strengthened his reputation as a brilliant tactician, and morale of his soldiers surged with confidence. He envisioned carrying the war beyond the borders of Virginia, into the very heart of the Union. For Lee, Pennsylvania was not just another battlefield. It was a stage where he could strike a psychological and political blow. By invading the North, he hoped to demoralize Union citizens, weaken their will to fight, and perhaps even sway European powers to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. The stakes were monumental, for if Lee succeeded, the balance of the entire war might tilt in his favor. The Union, however, was not blind to the danger. President Lincoln, keenly aware that public support for the war was fragile, knew that a Confederate triumph on Northern soil would be disastrous. His newly appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac, General George G. Meade, faced the enormous task of halting Lee's advance. Meade was cautious, pragmatic, and less flamboyant than his Confederate counterpart, but he commanded a massive army determined to defend their homeland. Both armies, numbering in the tens of thousands, were on a collision course, though neither side could yet imagine just how fateful their encounter would be. As the summer sun beat down upon the countryside, Lee's army moved northward through the Shenandoah Valley, crossing into Maryland and then Pennsylvania. The roads trembled with the sound of marching feet, the rumble of wagon wheels, and the clatter of hooves. Confederate soldiers, weary but resolute, carried dreams of victory across those dusty miles. Behind them stretched the shadow of war. Farms stripped of food, families displaced, and civilians terrified by the sudden arrival of gray-clad troops in their towns. For the people of Pennsylvania, the conflict that had once seemed distant now marched directly into their fields and streets. Meanwhile, the Union Army trailed in pursuit. Rumors and reports of Confederate movements filled the air with tension, and there was an eerie uncertainty about where the two colossal forces would meet. Some said Harrisburg might be Lee's target. Others feared Baltimore or even Philadelphia. But fate had its own design. In late June, both armies began to converge upon a small, unsuspecting town named Gettysburg, a place with little more than crossroads, farms, and quiet hills, yet destined to be etched forever into the pages of history. There is a mystery to how wars select their battlegrounds. Gettysburg was not chosen in some grand strategy session or carefully mapped plan. It was chance, almost an accident of movement and supply. Confederate troops seeking shoes for their worn-out soldiers stumbled into the town, only to find Union cavalry already positioned there. What began as a simple encounter soon escalated, drawing in more and more troops until the fields of Gettysburg transformed into the stage for one of the greatest battles the world had ever seen. The roads leading into Gettysburg seemed to draw both armies, as if guided by an unseen hand. It was as though destiny had chosen that patch of ground, forcing the Union and Confederate forces into an inevitable clash. The air itself seemed heavy with anticipation, charged with the knowledge that something immense was about to unfold. Farmers looked out from their barns and saw not just soldiers, but the tides of history rolling into their valleys. The land that had once known only harvest and quiet labor was about to be watered with blood. As Lee's columns pressed northward, he carried with him not just the hopes of the South, but also the burden of his gamble. Would his army, stretched far from its supply lines, truly deliver the crushing victory he imagined, or would his boldness collapse into ruin? Across the divide, Lincoln and the Union command prayed that Meade would rise to the challenge, for the very soul of the nation seemed to hang in the balance. By the final days of June, scouts and skirmishers began to trade fire near Gettysburg. The war, brutal and merciless, was about to concentrate its fury into 3 days of relentless fighting. Neither army fully knew what awaited them, nor could the townsfolk predict the transformation of their homes into a killing ground. Yet the pull of destiny was undeniable. What had started as a march of strategy and ambition was about to become something much more, a defining moment in American history, a crucible in which the future of the nation would be forged. And so, under the sweltering heat of the Pennsylvania summer, as cannons rolled into position and soldiers tightened their belts for battle, the prelude to Gettysburg reached its crescendo. The stage was set, the actors assembled, and the curtain about to rise on a clash that would echo not just across America, but across the world, for centuries to come. The morning of July 1st, 1863, began like any other in the quiet town of Gettysburg. But as the sun rose higher over fields and ridges, the first cracks of rifle fire shattered the peace. What had begun as a chance encounter between Confederate troops searching for supplies and Union cavalry standing guard quickly escalated into something far greater. Within hours, reinforcements from both armies poured into the area, swelling the skirmish into a massive engagement that neither side had anticipated. Dust and smoke thickened the air as more than 20,000 men clashed in the first day's struggle, their fate tied to the ridges, orchards, and rolling farmland of Pennsylvania. By nightfall, Union forces had been pushed back to the streets of Gettysburg, retreating to high ground of Cemetery Hill. For Confederates, it seemed like the beginnings of triumph, but the battle was only beginning, and destiny was far from decided. The second day dawned with tension that could almost be felt in the air, a silence heavy before the storm. Both armies had now fully committed to Gettysburg, each side determined not to yield. Lee sought to break the Union line quickly, believing that striking hard at the flanks would unravel their defenses. The Union, under Meade, understood the importance of holding the high ground, for whoever controlled the ridges and hills controlled the battlefield itself. As the summer heat bore down, the second day's fighting erupted with ferocity that would burn itself into memory. To the Union left, at a rocky outcrop known as Little Round Top, the fate of the battle teetered on the edge. Confederate forces surged forward, desperate to seize a position that overlooked the Union line. If Little Round Top fell, the entire Union army could be rolled up from the flank, and Lee might secure the decisive victory he sought. Wave after wave of Southern soldiers attacked, their battle cries echoing to the rocks and trees, but Union defenders clung to the hillside with a determination born of desperation. In the chaos, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of the 20th Maine made a fateful decision. Out of ammunition, his men fixed bayonets and charged downhill in a daring counterattack that stunned the Confederates and saved the Union left. It was a moment of almost mythical courage, one of those acts of defiance that alters the course of history. Meanwhile, across the battlefield, fierce combat raged in places whose names would forever be etched into legend: Devil's Den, the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field. Each patch of ground became a furnace of slaughter where men fought at point-blank range, muskets cracking, artillery thundering, and bodies falling in heaps. The Wheat Field, in particular, saw control shift back and forth multiple times as thousands of men clashed in a storm of blood and smoke. When the fighting finally subsided, the field was littered with the dead and wounded, a haunting silence replacing the roar of battle. On the Union right, at Culp's Hill, Confederate soldiers also hurled themselves against the defenses, but the terrain and resolve of the defenders held them back. Night fell with no clear victor, only the sobering reality of tens of thousands of casualties. The second day had been a maelstrom of violence, a test of endurance that left both armies bloodied but unbroken. By the third day, Lee believed that one more massive blow could break the Union center. He had seen success on the first day, and though the second had been inconclusive, he was convinced that the Army of Northern Virginia still had the strength to deliver victory. What followed would become one of the most famous and tragic moments in the history of warfare: Pickett's charge. Under the blazing afternoon sun of July 3rd, Confederate artillery opened a thunderous bombardment on the Union line along Cemetery Ridge. The ground trembled as cannons roared, filling the sky with smoke. Then, as the guns fell silent, nearly 12,000 Confederate soldiers formed into long, straight lines stretching across the fields. They began their march across open ground, bayonets gleaming, flags waving, the sheer sight of a display of grim determination. But the Union soldiers waited, dug in behind stone walls and fences, their artillery and rifles ready. As the Confederates advanced, the fields erupted with fire. Shot and shell tore through the lines, men falling by the hundreds, yet still they pressed forward. It was a march into the jaws of death, bravery meeting futility on an unforgiving stage. A few reached the Union line, clashing in desperate hand-to-hand combat, but the assault collapsed under the storm of Union fire. In less than an hour, thousands lay dead or wounded, and the dream of a Confederate victory at Gettysburg dissolved into smoke and blood. The 3 days of Gettysburg were unlike anything the American continent had ever seen. More than 160,000 men had fought in the fields, and by the end, nearly 50,000 were casualties. It was a scale of destruction that defied comprehension, leaving behind a landscape of devastation and a nation reeling from the enormity of its own civil war. For the Confederacy, it was a high water mark, the closest they would ever come to victory on Northern soil. For the Union, it was a hard-fought triumph that carried with it not only relief but also the weight of sacrifice. Yet beneath the smoke and statistics lies something more haunting, something that lingers in the memory of Gettysburg. The whispers of the soldiers, the cries of the wounded, the silence of the fallen, these remain woven into the very earth. Each ridge, each field, each stone wall is stained with stories that continue to echo, a reminder of how close the nation came to being torn apart forever. Gettysburg was not merely a battle of guns and generals. It was a battle of wills, of courage, of destiny. And in those 3 days, destiny chose a path that would shape the future of America. In the aftermath of those thunderous clashes, when the smoke began to lift and the echo of cannon fire faded into the summer air, the battlefield revealed another layer of history that too often remains hidden: the voices of the men who fought and the civilians who endured the storm. For every strategy drawn on a map and every order barked across the lines, there were human beings, flesh and blood, caught in the chaos of Gettysburg. Their stories, preserved in letters, diaries, and whispered accounts, carry an eerie intimacy, drawing us closer to the beating heart of a war that scarred a nation. Soldiers on both sides entered Gettysburg with mixed emotions. Many were young, boys barely in their late teens who had left behind farms, shops, and schools, now marching into the crucible of battle. Letters home reveal their fear and their yearning, scribbled by candlelight in shaky hands. A Confederate private wrote of longing for the sound of his mother's voice, confessing that he could hear her prayers even on the march north. A Union soldier, ink blotched by rain, described the quiet terror before the fighting began. "The fields are calm tonight, but we know it cannot last. Tomorrow we shall see what fate decides." These fragile pieces of paper, carried in breast pockets and knapsacks, became the last testimony for many who would never return home. As the fighting raged, the reality of war became brutally clear. Soldiers spoke of the deafening roar of musketry, the acrid sting of powder, the smell of blood mingled with earth. Some recalled seeing comrades fall beside them, struck down in an instant. Others remembered the strange stillness between assaults, when time seemed to stop and only the groans of the wounded pierced the silence. One Confederate veteran later wrote, "It was as though the very ground cried out beneath us, soaked with the lifeblood of friend and foe alike." Beyond the armies, the people of Gettysburg, ordinary men, women, and children, were thrust into the heart of the conflict without warning. For them, the battle arrived suddenly, like a storm breaking over the horizon. Civilians awoke to the sound of gunfire, saw their streets filled with soldiers, and watched their homes transform into makeshift hospitals. The townsfolk could do nothing but adapt. Churches, barns, and living rooms became crowded with the wounded, their walls echoing with moans and hurried whispers of surgeons. Kitchens turned into supply rooms, Wells ran dry from endless demands, and linen sheets were torn into bandages. Among these civilians, courage shone in unexpected ways. Women like Jenny Wade, the only civilian killed during the battle, embodied the risks faced by those who stayed. Wade was struck by a stray bullet while baking bread for Union soldiers, a reminder that death spared no one, soldier or civilian. Others risked everything to carry water to the dying, to comfort men far from home, or to guide surgeons as they fought to save lives with crude instruments and little more than chloroform. The voices of Gettysburg's townspeople remind us that this was not just a clash of armies, but a human disaster that enveloped an entire community. The battlefield itself became a landscape of sorrow, where soldiers lay wounded for hours, even days, before aid reached them. Diaries record haunting images. Men calling out for mothers, clutching family photographs, or reciting prayers as life slipped away. For the survivors, those cries never faded. Many would carry them in their minds long after the war ended, reliving the moment with every memory of Gettysburg. Yet even in the heart of horror, acts of compassion flickered like candles in the dark. There are accounts of soldiers from opposing sides sharing canteens, of Confederates and Union men lying wounded side by side and speaking softly to each other in their final hours. In those fleeting moments, the lines of battle dissolved and only humanity remained. Such stories, though rare, shine with a strange beauty against the backdrop of carnage, reminding us that even amid hatred, there is a capacity for mercy. The cost of these 3 days cannot be measured in numbers alone, though the numbers themselves are staggering. Nearly 50,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, left families shattered across the nation. Every casualty list printed in newspapers carried a ripple of grief into countless homes. For parents, wives, and children, Gettysburg was not an abstract battle in a far-off town, but a personal loss that altered their lives forever. What lingers most powerfully, however, are the memories passed down, the voices that refuse to be silenced. Veterans spoke of waking in the night decades later, hearing again the booming of artillery in their dreams. Townsfolk recalled the endless processions of wagons carrying the wounded, the smell of death hanging in the summer air long after the armies had gone. Gettysburg was not just an event confined to July of 1863. It became a haunting presence in the lives of those who lived it, an unshakable memory carved into their souls. And there is something mysterious about the way these voices still echo across the fields. Visitors to Gettysburg today often speak of a strange stillness, a silence heavy with memory. It is as if the land itself holds the stories, whispering them through the rustling of the wheat and the creak of old barns. Perhaps it is imagination, or perhaps it is the undeniable truth that history leaves its mark not only on paper and stone, but on the very earth where it unfolded. The battlefield is both graveyard and memorial, a place where the voices of soldiers and civilians intertwine, telling a story that is at once tragic, haunting, and deeply human. As the smoke cleared over Gettysburg and the echoes of musket fire faded into the hills, it became painfully clear that the battle had shifted more than just the immediate lines of engagement. It had altered the very course of the Civil War. The Confederacy, which had marched boldly into Pennsylvania with dreams of victory and recognition, found itself facing a sobering reality. General Robert E. Lee's ambitious invasion had been repelled, and the Army of Northern Virginia, once thought unstoppable, now bore the weight of defeat on Northern soil. For Lee, Gettysburg was more than a tactical setback. It was a high water mark of Confederacy, the point from which momentum would begin to slip inexorably away. Union forces, under General George G. Meade, experienced a hard-fought triumph, though the victory was tempered by staggering losses. The significance of Gettysburg went far beyond the immediate military advantage. It was a psychological turning point. Until that moment, the Confederacy had carried the initiative, pressing into Union territory, and giving hope to Southern sympathizers and European observers who quietly watched the war's progress. Gettysburg, however, demonstrated that the North could endure, could hold, and could repel even the most audacious of Confederate campaigns. The psychological effect rippled through the Union Army and the Northern public alike, restoring confidence in a war that had at times seemed endless and uncertain. The casualty figures themselves reveal the sheer magnitude of the battle. Over 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing, a staggering toll that left families mourning from Virginia to Maine. Entire regiments were decimated, towns and farms left scarred, and fields once fertile now soaked with blood. The Union Army held the high ground, yes, but victory had not come without tremendous cost. The Confederacy, too, would never recover the men lost at Gettysburg, a loss that would shape subsequent campaigns and constrain Lee's strategic options. Every ridge, every hill, every fence line carried the imprint of this turning point, a tangible reminder that the war's trajectory had shifted. Yet Gettysburg's impact extended beyond the immediate military and psychological effects. It was a lesson in the unpredictable nature of war, in the fragile interplay between strategy, terrain, and human endurance. Lee had relied on audacity, on bold maneuvers and calculated risks, yet those same risks led catastrophe when faced with an equally determined and strategically positioned enemy. The Union's use of high ground, defensive fortifications, and coordinated artillery fire transformed what could have been a disastrous encounter into a defining victory. Here, geography and tactics intertwined with human will, creating an outcome neither side could fully foresee. In the aftermath, the nation itself seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. News of the Union victory spread quickly, carried by telegraph and newspaper, bringing hope to a weary public. Yet the victory also underscored the war's grim reality. Freedom and preservation came at an unimaginable human cost. The images of Gettysburg, its fields strewn with the fallen, haunted the nation's consciousness. Families struggled to comprehend the scale of loss, while communities labored to recover from the immediate effects of such concentrated violence. The battle was over, but its shadow lingered, shaping public perception and the collective understanding of the war. Gettysburg also held a lesson in leadership and the weight of command. General Meade, often overshadowed by Lee's legendary status, had demonstrated prudence, adaptability, and courage under pressure. His decisions to hold key positions, to reinforce vulnerable flanks, and to coordinate artillery and infantry effectively ensured that the Union Army could withstand repeated Confederate assaults. For Lee, the battle became a study in the dangers of overreach and the limits of even brilliant command. History remembers Gettysburg not simply as a clash of armies, but as a confrontation of strategic philosophies, where daring ambition met disciplined preparation. Beyond strategy and numbers, Gettysburg carried symbolic weight, a resonance that would echo far beyond the immediate theater of war. The Union victory signaled that the dream of preserving the United States as a single, united nation was still alive. It reinforced the idea that the principles for which the war was fought, freedom, unity, and rejection of secession, could prevail even in the face of staggering adversity. Yet, embedded within this triumph was a haunting awareness of mortality and the cost of nationhood. The battlefield itself became a place of memory, a terrain where heroism and horror intertwined, leaving an indelible mark on all who witnessed it and on the generations that would follow. There is a certain mystery to how pivotal moments reveal themselves in history. At the time, neither Lee nor Meade could know that Gettysburg would become the turning point, the moment when the tides of war began to shift decisively. The smoke, the blood, and the cries of men obscured the significance in real time. Only with reflection does a pattern emerge, a culmination of strategy, courage, terrain, and sheer chance that altered the path of the nation. The victory at Gettysburg was not merely a win on the battlefield. It was a harbinger of the ultimate direction of the Civil War, a signal that the Confederacy's dreams of independence were slipping away, and that the Union could endure through unimaginable trial and loss. And as the sun set over the battered fields, casting long shadows over fences and ridges, Gettysburg remained a silent testament to sacrifice, a turning point etched into the nation's memory. It was more than a victory. It was a statement, a pivot on which the story of America would continue, forever shaped by the courage, despair, and destiny witnessed in those 3 fateful days. Long after the cannons fell silent and the last cries of the wounded faded into the rolling hills, Gettysburg did not return to the quiet calm it once knew. The fields, once the site of chance encounters and desperate combat, had become hallowed ground, carrying the weight of memory and the echoes of sacrifice. For the nation, Gettysburg was not merely a battle. It was a turning point, a moment when the course of history pivoted, and the soul of the United States was tested and reaffirmed. Yet its legacy extended beyond military victory or loss, into the realm of ideals, remembrance, and the shaping of national identity. The first gestures toward remembrance came swiftly as survivors and citizens struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had transpired. Homes and churches had been pressed into service as hospitals. Barns had been used to store munitions, and the very earth had absorbed the shock of thousands of deaths. Families, both local and from distant states, sought closure for loved ones lost. The sheer scale of casualties, more than 50,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, forced the nation to confront a grim reality. Freedom and unity came at a terrible cost. Yet amidst the grief, a desire emerged to honor those who had fought, to ensure that the lessons of Gettysburg endure beyond the immediate aftermath of war. It was into this context that Abraham Lincoln arrived nearly 4 months later, on November 19, 1863, to deliver what would become one of the most iconic speeches in human history. His words, famously concise yet deeply profound, did not dwell on strategy or victory. Instead, he spoke of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. In a few measured sentences, Lincoln elevated Gettysburg from a battlefield to a symbol, a testament to the principles for which men had fought and died. He reminded the living that the soldiers' sacrifices demanded more than mourning. They demanded action, the continuation of a nation dedicated to freedom and unity. Lincoln's address transformed Gettysburg from a local tragedy into a global symbol of the human cost of war and the ideals worth defending. Across the world, observers took note of the Union's resilience and the moral weight Lincoln imparted to the struggle. For the American public, the speech crystallized a sense of shared purpose and national identity. Yet beneath the clarity of his words lay the haunting reminder of the battlefield itself, where the dead and wounded still whispered stories that could never be erased. The land remembered, as if holding the memory of every musket shot, every cannon roar, and every soldier who had fallen into its soil. In the decade that followed, Gettysburg became a focal point for preservation and commemoration. Monuments rose where regiments had fought. Stone markers designated the final resting places of thousands, and museums chronicled the events in painstaking detail. Each monument carried not just the names of those who fell, but the essence of the battles themselves, the heroism, the tragedy, and the choices that defined the conflict. Today, visitors can trace the paths of Pickett's charge, gaze upon Little Round Top, and stand where soldiers once stared death in the face. The landscape itself tells a story that no textbook can fully capture, a narrative etched into the contours of hills and fields. Yet the mystery of Gettysburg endures. Walkers across the battlefield often report a profound sense of presence, an almost tangible echo of the past. The rustling leaves, the whispers of the wind, even the creak of old fences seem to carry the weight of history, as though the ground itself refuses to release its secrets. Scholars and tourists alike find themselves captivated not only by the events, but by the lingering spirit of those who fought and died there. The battlefield serves as a bridge between past and present, a space where history feels immediate, and the human experience of war is both palpable and haunting. Commemorations continue annually, drawing veterans, historians, students, and curious travelers from around the world. These gatherings are more than ceremonial. They are acts of remembrance that connect contemporary society with the choices and sacrifices of the past. Flags are raised, wreaths laid, and speeches delivered, but it is the quiet moments, the pause to consider the enormity of what occurred, that resonate most deeply. Gettysburg teaches that memory is not passive. It is an active engagement with the past, a recognition that history shapes the present and the future. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Gettysburg lies in its dual nature. It is both a tale of human suffering and a story of resilience, both a site of devastation and a symbol of hope. It reminds us that even in the darkest hours, courage and conviction can shape outcomes, and that the choices of a few can reverberate across generations. Soldiers, civilians, leaders, and witnesses all contributed to a story that transcends borders and time, a story that continues to captivate and teach those willing to listen. As the sun sets over the gentle ridges and fields of Pennsylvania today, Gettysburg stands not only as a memorial to the past, but as a living testament to endurance, reflection, and the eternal tension between war and peace. Every visitor who treads its paths participates, even unconsciously, in a dialogue with history, feeling the presence of those who came before and contemplating the ideals for which they fought. The battlefield, frozen in time yet alive in memory, remains a sacred space where history, mystery, and human experience converge, reminding the world that some places are more than land. They are the keepers of a nation's soul. The smoke has long cleared, the cannon silenced, yet Gettysburg continues to speak. Every ridge, every stone wall, every field holds whispers of bravery, loss, and determination. It is a place where the past is alive, where the echoes of history remind us that freedom and unity demand sacrifice, and where the story of a nation's soul was forged. Gettysburg is not just a battlefield. It is memory, legacy, and a testament to the courage that defines us all. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to History Vault, your gateway to the past.